We're talking about one of the greatest stories in all of history, a real clash of civilizations, a collision of entire cultures. And the battles that came out of it, they literally shaped the future of the Western world.
And that really is the mind-blowing question at the heart of it all. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath story, right? So, how on earth did this handful of tiny city-states defy the biggest, baddest empire on the planet? Well, let's dive in and find out.
All right, so first up, let's set the stage. In one corner, you've got the Achaemenid Persian Empire. These guys were an absolute colossus. And in the other corner, a messy, scattered collection of Greek city-states that honestly fought with each other as much as anyone else.
Whoa. Okay, this map really says it all, doesn't it? Just look at the scale of this thing. The Persian Empire it's just massive, stretching all the way from India to Egypt. And then, look way over there. You see that tiny little peninsula? That's Greece. On paper, this shouldn't even be a fight. It's a walkover. Now see that little cluster of Greek cities right on the edge of the empire? That's a place called Ionia. You're going to want to remember that name.
So the big question is, how did this whole thing even kick off? Well, you might be surprised to hear that it didn't actually start in Greece itself. Nope. The first spark was lit way over in that region we just pointed out, Ionia.
Okay, so let's walk through how this all snowballed. For years, decades even, the Ionian Greeks had been under Persian rule, and they were not happy about it. By 499 BCE, they'd finally had enough. Boom, they revolt. But here's where it gets really interesting. Athens, way over on the Greek mainland, decides to send ships to help them out. A huge, fateful decision. Because now, Athens is on the radar of the Persian king, Darius I. He demands that all of Greece bow down to him. And, well, they said no. The stage was set for a massive invasion.
And that invasion, it comes. In 490 BCE, a huge Persian force lands on a beach only about 25 miles from Athens itself. The name of that beach? Marathon. For the people of Athens, this was it. This was do or die.
Okay, so the Persians had way more guys, and they had this incredible cavalry, a game changer. The Athenian general, a guy named Miltiades, he knew a head-on attack was just suicide. So what did he do? He waited. For 5 days, these two armies just stared at each other. Can you imagine the tension? Then Miltiades spots his opening. The Persians are getting antsy, and they start loading their cavalry, their elite troops, back onto the ships. Their plan was to just sail around and take Athens directly. And in that moment, with their biggest threat on the boats, Miltiades gives the order, charge.
And the result? It was absolutely insane. The Greek hoplites, these heavily armored tanks of men, just slammed into the Persian infantry. And here's the key. The Greek phalanx formation, this tight wall of shields and spears, was basically impenetrable for the lightly armored Persians, especially without their cavalry to back them up. It was a total rout. The Persians broke and ran for the ships. Get this, the historian Herodotus says the final body count was something like 6,400 Persians to just 192 Athenians. Unbelievable.
So you have to understand, this was so much more than just a battle. It was a massive psychological victory. It sent this shockwave through the entire Greek world. For the very first time, they realized, wait a minute, these guys can be beaten. That day, on that beach, wasn't just a victory, it was the birth of hope.
But here's the thing. The Persians weren't beaten. Not really. They were embarrassed. And 10 years later, they came back for revenge. This time, it's King Darius' son, Xerxes, and he brings an army that makes the first one look tiny. He was not going to fail like his dad did. And this time, to get into Greece, his massive army had to squeeze through this one narrow little coastal pass, a place called Thermopylae.
And right here, geography itself becomes a weapon. The Greeks, there are only about 7,000 of them, led by the legendary Spartan king Leonidas. They picked this spot on purpose. Why? Because it was a natural bottleneck. You got mountains on one side, the sea on the other. It meant the huge Persian army couldn't use its numbers against them. They were forced into this tiny front, basically fighting a handful of Greeks at a time.
And this terrain was just perfect for how the Greeks fought. See, the Persians like to hang back, shoot a million arrows, then send in the cavalry. But in a narrow pass, that strategy is totally useless. On the other hand, you have the Greek hoplite. We're talking heavy armor, a massive bronze shield, a long spear, all locked together in that phalanx formation. They were the perfect weapon for this exact situation. Literally a human wall of bronze and iron.
And for 3 days, 3 unbelievable days, this tiny force held off the entire Persian army. There in the end, they were betrayed, outflanked, and wiped out.
But don't think of Thermopylae as a failure. It was a legendary, heroic sacrifice. And it bought the rest of Greece just enough time to evacuate the city of Athens and get their navy ready for what was coming next.
So Athens is in flames. The Greek army is on the run. The war now shifts from the land to the sea. And everything, absolutely everything, is going to come down to one single naval battle, right off the coast of an island called Salamis.
And yeah, you guessed it, the odds were once again just completely insane. Xerxes has this gigantic fleet, something like 800 ships. The Greeks, they've got maybe 370 if they're lucky. It looks hopeless. But the Greeks had a secret weapon, not a ship, but a man, the Athenian commander, a brilliant strategist named Themistocles.
Now, Themistocles was smart. He knew he couldn't take on that massive fleet in the open ocean. No way. He had to pull a Thermopylae, but on the water. So he hatches this brilliant plan. He lays a trap. He sends one of his most trusted guys to the Persian king, Xerxes, with a secret message. The guy pretends to be a traitor, and he tells Xerxes that the Greeks are freaking out and are planning to run for it in the middle of the night. And Xerxes? He fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. He immediately orders his fleet to block all the exits of the narrow straits of Salamis to trap the Greeks before they can escape. But see, that's exactly what Themistocles wanted. He'd lured them into a bottleneck. In that tiny channel, the massive Persian ships were clumsy. They couldn't turn. Their numbers were actually a bad thing now, creating this giant naval traffic jam. And that's when the Greek triremes, smaller, faster, more agile, swooped in and just started ramming and smashing the disorganized Persian ships to pieces. For the Persian navy, it was an absolute catastrophe. We're talking about 300 ships lost, thousands and thousands of men dead. And the Greeks? They lost maybe 40 ships. It was one of the most lopsided and decisive naval victories in the history of the world. And it wasn't won by force, it was won by brains.
And a victory like that, it didn't just save the Greek navy. No, this moment changed everything.
You can just picture it. Xerxes, sitting on this golden throne on the shore, watching his entire navy get demolished. He was furious, and he knew right then and there his invasion was over. Without his navy, he had no supply lines, so he tucks tail and runs back to Asia, leaving his huge land army just stranded in Greece. This was the break the Greeks needed. It gave them time to finally unite, and the very next year, they destroyed what was left of the Persian army, ending the invasion once and for all.
But you know, that final victory, it was only possible because of the sacrifices that came before. And nothing captures that spirit better than this famous line, written for the Spartans who died at Thermopylae. It perfectly sums up that incredible defiance we saw from Marathon all the way to Salamis. This idea that you'd rather die for your laws and your freedom than live under a king.
And that really leaves us with a huge question to think about, doesn't it? These weren't just some dusty old battles. They were turning points in history that literally shaped the world we live in today. I mean, just think, if it weren't for the guts of Leonidas or the pure genius of Miltiades and Themistocles, would the ideas of democracy and freedom, things that started in Greece, have ever even survived? It's pretty incredible to think about what was really at stake.
Years after the ashes of the Persian Wars settled, an entirely new kind of civilization emerged in Greece. We find the record of how that society was built painted directly onto the clay of their pottery. In those early post-war decades, Athens was tightly controlled by an elite conservative council known as the Areopagus. The Areopagus was an aristocratic body of former magistrates who held absolute veto power over the city's laws and courts. Born into this exact ruling class was a young man named Pericles. His mother belonged to the Alcmeonidae, a wealthy, historically powerful noble family that had dominated Athenian politics for generations. While his birthright offered a path of traditional power, Pericles chose to study under rationalist philosophers like Anaxagoras. Rationalism is a school of thought that relies on reason and empirical observation, rather than religious myth, to explain the physical world. This education gave him a highly analytical, detached way of examining political problems. He also possessed a distinct physical quirk, an unusually elongated head. To avoid the mockery of rival politicians, he habitually wore a pushed-back Corinthian helmet in public, creating his iconic silhouette. His aristocratic family groomed him to inherit and protect their traditional oligarchy. Instead, he used his philosophical training to systematically dismantle it. He began by forming a strategic alliance with Ephialtes, a populist politician pushing for direct reforms in favor of the lower classes. In 462 BC, they executed a legislative coup, passing laws that stripped the Areopagus of its absolute veto power, draining their legal authority. That power transferred directly to the assembly, giving the common citizen direct voting control over courts, foreign policy, and laws. To protect this new system from conservative retaliation, Pericles utilized ostracism. This was a democratic mechanism where citizens could exile any politician for 10 years by scratching their name onto a broken pottery shard. Using this tool, he banished his chief rival, Cimon. By legally neutralizing his opponents and giving legislative control to the masses, Pericles centralized his own influence while engineering a direct democracy. With his domestic power secured, he initiated a period of explosive cultural growth, funded by repurposing the massive treasury of the Delian League. The Delian League was originally a mutual defense alliance of Greek city-states, formed to repel future Persian invasions. He poured those funds into a massive public works program. The crown jewel of this effort was the Parthenon, an enormous marble temple dedicated to Athena, built to physically demonstrate Athenian supremacy. He was equally aggressive in his patronage of the arts. He sponsored major theatrical productions, personally funding the performance of politically charged tragedies like Aeschylus the Persians. He cultivated an environment of free inquiry, welcoming the greatest thinkers of the ancient world to debate openly in the Athenian agora. Through this combination of architecture, the public theater, and state-sponsored philosophy, Athens transitioned from a regional military power into the educational and cultural capital of Greece. But that cultural explosion came at a cost. Athens treated Delian League allies as subjects, extracting tribute by force. This rapid imperial expansion bred deep paranoia in their primary rival, Sparta. When Sparta issued ultimatums demanding Athens grant autonomy to its allies, Pericles refused to compromise. He argued that yielding to any Spartan demand would dissolve the Athenian Empire. His own hardline stance made conflict inevitable. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War began as Spartan infantry forces marched into Athenian territory, laying waste to the surrounding countryside. Instead of meeting the Spartan army in open battle, Pericles pulled the rural population behind the impregnable long walls. While Spartans besieged the land, the superior Athenian navy maintained an uninterrupted flow of supplies through the port of Piraeus. At the end of the first year of fighting, Pericles stood before the citizens to deliver a public eulogy, his famous funeral oration, to mourn the soldiers who had already fallen. Pericles centered the speech on his belief that Athenian democracy, equality, and freedom were uniquely exceptional values, framing them as a cause worth the ultimate sacrifice. The funeral oration served as a complete ideological defense. It justified the harsh realities of maintaining their empire and the devastating war required to sustain it. But his brilliant defensive strategy contained a fatal flaw. By trapping tens of thousands of rural refugees behind the city walls, he created a severe, unsanitary overcrowding problem. In 430 BC, a horrific epidemic known as the Plague of Athens swept through those cramped quarters. The disease decimated the trapped civilian and military populations alike. The epidemic struck Pericles personally, claiming the lives of his two legitimate sons, Perillus and Xanthippus. Observers noted the loss broke his usually stoic spirit. A year later, in 429 BC, Pericles himself succumbed to the plague. He left behind a fractured, grieving city, suddenly devoid of its primary architect. Without his calculated, restrained leadership to guide the military, Athenian strategy grew erratic. The city would eventually suffer total defeat, and Sparta would dismantle the empire piece by piece. He established the physical and democratic systems that would heavily influence Western civilization.
For nearly 3 decades, back in the 5th century BCE, the Greek world just tore itself apart. Now, this wasn't just any war, it was a total war. It pitted neighbor against neighbor, it shattered a golden age, and it completely redrew the map of power in the ancient world. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that ends with the tragic fall of Athens. You know, the Athenian historian and General Thucydides, a guy who actually lived through it all, he knew right from the start that this thing was going to be monumental. He got the stakes, he got the scale, and he understood its devastating potential. So he dedicated his life to writing it all down, so that people like us, generations later, could understand what happened. All right, to really get this epic tragedy, we're going to walk through 5 key acts. First, how the world was divided. Then, the grinding stalemate of the war's first phase. After that, the single biggest mistake Athens ever made. And finally, its collapse, and the grim aftermath for all of Greece. So let's dive right into Act 1. At the very heart of this war were 2 city-states, 2 alliances, and two completely different ways of life, both locked in a massive struggle for dominance. On one side, you had Athens. Think of it as this vibrant, seafaring democracy leading what was called the Delian League, which had basically become an Athenian maritime empire. Then on the other side, you've got Sparta, a super rigid, military-first society run by an oligarchy that's ruled by a select few. Sparta's whole deal was its legendary land army of hoplites, these heavily armed foot soldiers, and they ran their own alliance, the Peloponnesian League. It really was a classic clash, sea power versus land power, democracy versus oligarchy. You can see how conflict was pretty much inevitable. So the war kicks off in 431 BCE, but here's the thing, neither side could land a knockout blow. What came next was a brutal decade of raids, sieges, and just immense suffering, a phase we now call the Persian War. The basic strategy was pretty simple. Sparta would march into Athenian territory every year, trying to force a big land battle. But the Athenians would just retreat behind their massive city walls and use their powerful navy to raid Sparta's coasts instead. This grinding pattern was horribly broken, though, by an enemy nobody saw coming. A horrific plague swept through crowded Athens. It killed a third of the entire population, including their brilliant leader, Pericles. The war just dragged on until 422 BCE at the Battle of Amphipolis, where in this really strange twist of fate, the most aggressive, pro-war generals from both sides were killed. That kind of paved the way for a very fragile truce. And get this, here's a little detail that I think is just amazing. Who was serving in the Athenian ranks this whole time, fighting as a common foot soldier, a hoplite in these brutal campaigns? None other than the philosopher Socrates. It's just a cool reminder that this epic history was lived by real people. But that peace, yeah, it didn't last. The rivalry just kept festering, and a frustrated, exhausted Athens decided to make a really bold move to break the stalemate once and for all. It would turn out to be the single worst decision in its entire history.
So put yourself in their shoes. What's the strategic problem? Athens couldn't beat Sparta's army on land. They needed to find a new front, a way to cripple Sparta's allies and expand their own empire so dramatically that Sparta would just be forced to give up.
The plan they came up with was breathtakingly ambitious. In 415 BCE, Athens launched this massive naval expedition to go conquer Syracuse, the most powerful city on the island of Sicily. The thinking was, if they could control Sicily's huge wealth and resources, they wouldn't just cripple Spartan allies, they'd get an unbeatable advantage for the rest of the war. It was a high-stakes, all-or-nothing imperial gamble.
And to put it bluntly, it was an unmitigated disaster, just a total catastrophe. The expedition got bogged down by political drama, really poor leadership, and resistance that was way fiercer than they expected. After 2 years of just brutal fighting, the entire Athenian force was annihilated. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors were killed or captured. It was a military disaster on a scale the Greek world had rarely ever seen.
That defeat in Sicily left Athens grievously wounded. Its navy was shattered, its treasury was empty, its confidence completely broken. This was the turning point. For Sparta? Well, this was blood in the water. This was the moment to go for the kill. Now remember, Sparta was a land power. They just didn't have the navy or the money to challenge Athens at sea. So, in this stunning geopolitical twist, they made a deal with their old arch-enemy, the Persian Empire. You heard that right. Persia provided the gold, and Sparta built the fleet. The decisive moment finally came in 405 BCE. The new Spartan admiral, a brilliant and totally ruthless commander named Lysander, cornered the last major Athenian fleet at a place called Aegospotami. For a few days, the Athenians sailed out, trying to start a fight, but Lysander refused. Then he waited.
When the Athenian crews had gone ashore to find food, he launched a devastating surprise attack. The result was absolute annihilation. I mean, just look at these numbers. It's staggering. Athens lost nearly its entire fleet, something like 160 ships. Thousands of captured Athenian sailors were just executed on the spot, and Sparta's losses? Minimal. In a single afternoon, Athenian sea power, the foundation of its empire for a century, was just gone, wiped out. Without its navy, Athens was helpless. It couldn't protect the vital grain shipments from the Black Sea that fed its people. Surrounded by a Spartan army on land and blockaded by Lysander's new fleet at sea, the great city of Athens began to starve. In 404 BCE, the jewel of Greece surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. So, Sparta had won, but that victory came at an enormous cost, not just for Athens, but for the entire Greek world. Let's take a look at the legacy of this 3-decade-long war. Now, the end of the war meant a huge shift in what the Greeks called hegemony. That's basically just a word for the leadership or dominance of one state over all the others. So, what was the ultimate fallout? Well, the Athenian Empire was dismantled completely. Sparta took its place as the top dog, but its brutal rule was super unpopular and sparked even more conflict. The real legacy, though, was felt all across Greece. We're talking decades of poverty, depopulation, and just deep bitterness. In the end, all this endless infighting left all the Greek city-states so weak and divided that they became easy prey for a new power rising in the north, Macedon, led by King Philip II and his son, a kid who would soon be known as Alexander the Great. And that leaves us with a final, pretty sobering thought. Sparta got what it wanted, right? It dismantled the Athenian Empire. But in the process, the entire Greek world was exhausted and broken. Its golden age ended forever. So you really have to ask yourself, in a war that caused so much destruction, who was the real loser?
By 371 BC, Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War had left them as the dominant power in the Greek world. For generations, no opposing army could withstand their heavy infantry on a flat plain. This created a psychological weapon that preceded them into every battle, a widespread belief that the Spartan line simply could not be broken. This power relied on the Spartiates, a class of elite citizens who were separated from their families at birth and subjected to a lifelong military training regimen. Sparta weaponized this elite force through the Peloponnesian League, using the alliance to extract resources and crush any Greek city-state that tried to assert its own independence. But this long history of success left them vulnerable. The Spartans' rigid adherence to their own tradition blinded them to the possibility of a tactical response from a smaller state. That response emerged at a peace conference in Sparta. The meeting was intended to lock in Spartan control by forcing individual cities to sign the treaty as isolated states. During the negotiations, a Theban general named Epaminondas stood his ground. He insisted on signing the treaty on behalf of all Boeotia, the regional confederacy led by Thebes. This was a direct challenge to the authority of Spartan king Agesilaus II. Agesilaus was deeply insulted. He immediately struck Thebes from the treaty and ordered a mobilization to crush the city and dismantle its regional league. Spartan king Cleombrotus marched an army of 11,000 troops into Boeotia. Epaminondas moved to intercept them near the village of Leuctra, bringing only 6,000 men. By refusing to yield at the conference, Epaminondas forced a physical confrontation, where his outnumbered forces had to secure a victory or see Thebes destroyed. To understand the battle, we have to look at the geometry of standard Greek warfare. Armies formed symmetrical lines, usually 12 ranks deep. By tradition, a commander always placed his elite troops on the right flank. Epaminondas knew that matching this formation against the Spartans was impossible. Their superior training meant the Spartan right wing would inevitably roll over the weaker Theban left. He decided to break the standard geometry. Moving his own elite troops to his left flank, he placed them directly opposite the Spartan king. Then, instead of a shallow line, he packed that left wing into a massive, concentrated column, 50 ranks deep. At the very tip of this spear, he placed the sacred band. This was a professional unit of 150 pairs of lovers, highly motivated and trained for this specific, heavy impact. Epaminondas abandoned symmetry entirely. He created a strategy of concentrated force designed to strike the Spartan leadership directly and decapitate their army. But committing all those troops to his left the rest of the Theban line dangerously thin. If the Spartans engaged those weak sections, the Thebans would be rapidly surrounded. To protect his weak side, Epaminondas used an oblique order. He ordered his center and right wings to step backward, forming a staggered, diagonal line that delayed contact with the enemy. The battle opened with the Theban column driving forward, slamming into the Spartan right wing with the crushing momentum of 50 men pushing against 12. The Spartan right wing could not absorb the physical pressure. The formation broke under the weight, and King Cleombrotus was killed in the close quarters fighting. With their king dead and their elite warriors destroyed, the Spartans' morale collapsed. The invincible army routed before the rest of the lines had even made contact. After the retreat, the tactical victory gave way to a grim reality for the Spartan state. Of the 700 full Spartiate citizens present at Leuctra, 400 lay dead on the field. Because Sparta relied on extremely restrictive citizenship laws, their population of elite warriors was already small. They had no way to replace such a high percentage of their core fighting force. Earlier in the campaign, the Spartans had captured several Theban ships, but that minor gain meant nothing compared to this sudden, irreplaceable loss of manpower. Leuctra was more than a defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe that permanently crippled Sparta's ability to field dominant armies. The myth of Spartan invincibility was gone. Within a few years, the Peloponnesian League disintegrated as formerly subjugated allies rebelled against their weakened masters. Thebes briefly took its place as the dominant power in Greece, completely shifting the balance of the ancient Mediterranean. While Thebes' rise was short-lived, its ideas were not. A young Macedonian hostage named Philip II lived in Thebes and studied Epaminondas's innovations. He brought these principles of concentrated force back to his own kingdom and passed them to his son. The innovation at Leuctra provided the foundational logic of weighted wings and staggered lines that Alexander would eventually use to dismantle the Achaemenid Empire. In 359 BC, the Kingdom of Macedonia faced total collapse. Invading Illyrian forces pushed from the west, Paeonian raiders struck from the north, and Thracians pressured the eastern borders. The breaking point arrived when the Macedonian king, Pericles III, marched out to meet the Illyrians and was killed in action. 4,000 Macedonian troops died alongside him, leaving the state without a coordinated defense. This carved marble bust depicts the man who inherited the ruins, Pericles' younger brother, Philip II. He took the throne of a bankrupt frontier state that the powerful Greek city-states to the south dismissed as a land of barbarians. This crisis offered Philip a blank slate. To ensure the kingdom's survival, he began a total reorganization of the Argeat state. The information needed for this reorganization was gathered years earlier. As a teenager, Philip spent 3 years as a political hostage in the powerful Greek city-state of Thebes. During his captivity, he closely observed the Theban general Epaminondas, taking detailed mental notes on how the general utilized innovative battlefield formations and political maneuvering. Traditional Greek warfare relied on rigid pushing matches between citizen militias. Philip began to conceive of something different, a centralized fighting force that relied on professional drilling and total synchronization. He also studied the internal dynamics of his captors. He saw that the fiercely independent Greek city-states were constantly at odds, realizing that their refusal to unite made them vulnerable to outside manipulation. By keeping the young prince captive, the Greeks provided Philip with the exact strategic and psychological insights he would later use to dismantle their supremacy. When Philip returned to Macedonia and took power, he changed the infantry's primary weapon. He replaced the traditional 8-foot Greek spear with the sarissa, a massive pike measuring up to 18 feet long. The sarissa changed battlefield geometry. The first 5 rank spear points extended beyond the front line, forcing traditional hoplites to halt out of striking distance. In side profile, rear ranks held their pikes upright, creating a dense wooden screen that deflected incoming arrows mid-flight. Philip paid his men to drill year-round, creating a standing professional army. He banned the use of ox carts and drastically reduced the number of camp followers, forcing soldiers to carry their own rations and weapons. He also integrated mechanical torsion catapults and heavy siege engines into his columns. Instead of waiting years to starve a city into submission, the Macedonian army could now break through stone fortifications in weeks. These reforms turned the Macedonian military into a specialized industry that operated independently of the agricultural season, creating a force that could outmarch and outlast any opponent in the region. While his army grew, Philip secured his flanks through marriage. He took multiple wives from neighboring kingdoms, using these unions to forge binding treaties and rapidly secure his borders against raids. As he expanded southward, he used bribery and conflicting political pacts to ensure the Greek city-states remained divided. By the time they recognized the threat, they were too busy fighting each other to coordinate a defense. The Greek states finally allied together in 338 BC, but at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's heavy phalanx broke the combined last-stand forces of Athens and Thebes. This gold Nicotarian coin, struck with Philip's likeness, verifies the economic and absolute political authority he consolidated following that victory. He immediately established the League of Corinth, a legal framework that placed the Greek states under his direct command. Chaeronea demonstrated that when centralized force is paired with divisive diplomacy, the independent city-states were left with no viable path to resistance. In 336 BC, the Macedonian court gathered in the capital of Aegae for a grand royal wedding. The celebration took place on the eve of Philip's next campaign, an invasion of the Persian Empire. As the festivities began, Philip instructed his guards to keep their distance. He chose to enter the public theater unprotected, a move designed to present himself as a legitimate, approachable leader rather than a tyrant. But waiting near the entrance was a member of his own bodyguard, a man named Pausanias. Driven by an unresolved personal grievance and the internal friction of the Macedonian court, Pausanias rushed forward and fatally stabbed the king. The aftermath was chaotic. The assassin sprinted for a getaway horse waiting at the city gates, but the animal stumbled. Before Pausanias could be questioned, Philip's remaining guards swarmed the fallen man and killed him on the spot. A single, personal act of violence had brought the entire Macedonian coalition to a standstill. It revealed that for all its military strength, the new order was tied entirely to the life of one man. The kingdom immediately faced a succession crisis. Philip's 20-year-old son, Alexander, moved swiftly, executing potential rivals and securing the support of the army to take the throne. Alexander inherited a completed operational system. He took command of a professional army, a pacified Greek mainland, and a unified command structure that was already mobilized and ready to cross into Asia. This mosaic depicts the son who would take that army to the Indus River. While Philip pursued specific geopolitical objectives, Alexander applied a different level of ambition that reorganized the borders of the Mediterranean and the Near East. Alexander drove the campaign of conquest to the edges of the map, but it was Philip II who built the engine, standing as the architect of the systems that made those victories possible.